We'll
Hi,
cut that
Brian.
part out too. How are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing better. Doing better now. I'm going to say, I'm at some point during this conversation, I'm going to say Brian's, and you're going to hear it and talk, or I'm going to say Brian, and Brian's going to hear that and talk. And I
Yeah.
just want to apologize in advance.
Yeah. Do we want to just? I have a nickname for these days. Do you just want to call me T?
What if we just call you BT because T is too much?
I'll take it.
How about-
That's because it's the
how about
Titanfall
cheekbone?
droid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Brian, with an N,
What do you need?
you're joining us. You're the game director on Tyranny, published by Paradox, and you are at Obsidian, which developed the game. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and about how you got into game dev?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, started playing games from a very, very young age, and basically grew up playing games, spent probably far too many late nights playing games in school, and got some low grades as a result of that. Went to school, got a programming degree, and never really thought I'd be able to do anything with it. And then when I was in school, I was playing an online game and would post on the forums with just random ideas like bugs and issues and things. And finally, one of the developers is like, "Hey, you're pretty mouthy. Why don't you just apply for a position and fix it for yourself?" It's like, okay, I'll do that.
What game was that?
It was actually an online game back on America Online called Dragon Realms. It was a fantasy text-based game. This was back when those were the height of online gaming, before Ultima Online came out and showed that, ooh, graphics and gameplay can work too.
Who would have thought?
I know, amazing. Like, not like single-player games been doing that for years beforehand at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I started working on that and kind of taught myself how to program by working for that game, and then went on to get a degree in programming. And when I was actually getting ready to graduate, thought, hey, I'll look for a real job in the game industry, and ended up working at Westwood Studios on Earth and Beyond, another MMO.
Nice.
And then from there, just been various places throughout the industry, and now working here at Obsidian.
Yeah. And yeah, how long have you been at Obsidian then, working on RPGs?
Well, this is actually my second time working at Obsidian. I've been here almost 5 years at this point, and I worked here briefly in 2004, 2005 on a project that was canceled, and then very briefly on the early pre-production of Alpha Protocol.
Oh, okay. So Tyranny just came out somewhat recently. Can you tell us a little bit about the game for people who aren't familiar?
Yes, I mean, Tyranny is an isometric role-playing game in the same vein as like Pillars of Eternity that came out last year, and classics like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale. The main thing that we're doing very differently with Tyranny is that we have the premise of the world is that evil has won. Like, the grand struggle between good and evil is over, and the Overlord triumphed, and you were part of the conquering army that led to the Overlord's victory. So you kind of begin the game as part of the evil empire. You're part of evil middle management, effectively. And as you're playing through the game, you have to decide whether you want to keep your involvement in that evil bureaucracy, whether you want to rebel against it, or really double down and try and crush any resistance to the Overlord's rule.
So,
Go ahead, Alex.
well, what I want to know is how did you come to be the director on this project? Like, because if viewers don't know, like, this project has sort of a long history at the studio, right? I mean, the ideas that went into this have been kicking around in some form or another for, I think, a decade, right? Like 2006.
For quite a while, yes. Mm-hmm. So the first time I worked at Obsidian, like that was again a project that was canceled. But it was like while they were working on Neverwinter Nights 2, and after Knights of the Old Republic 2 had released, and I would talk with various of the owners about, like, if I got to make my Star Wars game, what it would be. And the thing that I always wanted to do, rather than doing the whole like light side versus dark side choice, is really just focus on the dark side. Get to play the Emperor. Get to have the evil plan that I'm enacting by manipulating people throughout the world. And so I think after when I came back, I was working on South Park Stick of Truth, which is its own brand of evil, its own the type of humor it has. So when I was working on that, we were looking at what we like other projects that the studio could work on, and this was after a large project had been canceled, and the core team of that had gone on to work on the Kickstarter for Pillars of Eternity, and that took off and was really successful. And it kind of showed that several publishers that this type of game could be successful and would have an audience. So we were working with like pitches for various different games and various different publishers, and the idea for Tyranny, like that core concept of like a world where evil had won, had kind of been around the studio in various permutations throughout the years, and we decided to really like pick it up and run with it again and turn it into the world that became the world of Tyranny.
Right on.
So I want to talk about that when you were pitching to publishers and you're starting to want to do an isometric RPG here in post 2005 like era. Can you talk about the appeal, because there was a time it's kind of like you have huge sprawling first person RPGs, but there continues to be an appeal for the isometric kind of classic format. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think the appeal always existed. I don't think that the desire for people to play this type of game ever really went away. I think it became more of a business thing, and this is something that Fergus Urquhart, our CEO, has talked about in various interviews, that the budget and margin on these games is not in like the publisher's sweet spot. That for a lot of the larger publishers, like either there's the smaller mobile titles or the giant console RPGs that are going to sell $12-13 million. Like that's where they want to spend their money. And this type of game falls into this middle zone where the budget is smaller, is like bigger than a mobile title, but smaller than like a massive RPG, and the return is less than they're going to expect from like a Skyrim or a Fallout 4. So it was very hard to get a publisher interested in funding this type of game because it just the money in the return wasn't there for them. That they didn't see the reason to put their money towards this versus a smaller or a larger title. And then with the surgence of crowdfunding with like Wasteland 2, Divinity: Original Sin, and Pillars, helped show several publishers that there actually is a large enough audience they could make some money on this. And we ended up working with Paradox, who is they have like their core audience of grand strategy games with things like Hearts of Iron, Crusader Kings, that sort of thing. And they love RPGs, they love playing RPGs, and they wanted to start looking at making one and developing experience with working on RPGs as well. So, and the type of budget for this game was in their wheelhouse for the type that they like to spend on funding and publishing a game. So it just worked out really well that with the success of Pillars and developing relationships with Paradox, we really came together and said, okay, we can now make another RPG that actually we can get funding from a publisher to develop and reuse a lot of the tech we developed for Pillars of Eternity, which really allowed us to save a lot of time and energy in developing the game and just focus on making the game what it was.
Yeah, I think like one thing we all want to know is what it's like to make a role-playing game where you are bad. Like you're just a bad person hanging out with bad people, and it's like you have to really dig to find anyone that is what you might call like moral. Good. Like I imagine that you must have like a slate of stories about like conversations you had during development, or like arguments or problems and challenges. Like what should people know about the challenges that come with trying to make a game like this intriguing and interesting to play?
So I think one of the things that actually really helped for developing Tyranny is that a lot of the team, especially the design team, worked on South Park. And after working on that game, there are no filters anymore. Like it basically broke down every shred of decency we might have left as human beings. So, basically at that point, talking about a character being evil, like this is not that much of a stretch. Like the things we would talk about having people do after some of the design discussions we would have that were legitimate design discussions and not like HR fireable offenses that we would have on South Park. Working on a game about evil is just child's play at that point. So
I know we're here for Tyranny, but I want to hear some of this stuff that happened the development of South Park.
Well, I mean, you played Stick of Truth?
Yeah, okay. I guess I can get an idea of the conversations that went on.
Well, I mean, just imagine a design team discussion trying to design the layout for the Mr. Slave levels.
Oh, jeez.
So, like, what's so interesting to me?
Kind of to break down the barriers that you might have normally as a designer in a company.
Right.
But so South Park is like evil for catharsis, right? Like it's humor. It's a goof, and it can be really disturbing if you take it seriously, but like you're usually not meant to. Whereas this game, it doesn't have, at least up front, that veneer of humor and just goofy childishness. Like it does treat with some pretty serious topics, like wanton mass murder and mostly just murder, really, slavery and murder. And it's pretty light about it, but I wouldn't say it's humorous. So how did you walk that line, or how did your team walk that line in trying to make it approachable and not terrible, but also not a big goof?
So I think, absolutely, Tyranny is a much more of a serious game than South Park was, and deliberately so. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to give players an experience of playing an evil character, but we didn't want to trivialize what evil was. So we didn't want to turn into this obviously RPGs are a power fantasy, and one of the things we promised the player from the very beginning is that they begin the game as a person of importance and someone who's powerful in this evil empire. And we want to make that fun and interesting for players as well. But we don't try to sugarcoat what the consequences of your decisions are. So when you choose to have someone killed, there can be a fairly explicit description of exactly how that person dies and why it's not this fade to black romanticized notion of an execution that might happen on a on a TV show where you don't actually see the brutality of what happens. That was actually important for us to show that we're not trying to romanticize evil. We're trying to, through our dialogue systems and reputation systems, explore some of the ways that evil happens, which is when you are just treat everything as impersonal or look out for your own advantage or your own self-interest, it's very easy to be swayed to making very awful decisions. And sometimes you're faced with decisions where you don't have all the information. You don't always know the consequences of the decision you're going to make. And that's real life. That is how a lot of decisions get made, where you try to make the best choice you can given imperfect information, and sometimes something awful comes out as a result of that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The storyline of this game, the protagonists and the characters you meet, they don't laugh at violence. They're just inured to it. It's just pedestrian at this point. And so, as somebody who doesn't feel that way in real life, there's one character that I stopped taking with me because something she said was so, a part of her background was so terrible, and she was so just blasé about it. But as a game director and as a creator, was that stressful at all to constantly be working on something like this and trying to figure out ways to make horrible things seem pedestrian while trying to just make a game for however long it took, a year or so?
No, actually, Tyranny's been in development. I've been on the project for almost 3 years at this point.
Okay.
So, in some ways, it wasn't. There was obviously stress involved in making the game, of trying to meet deadlines and get game systems to work and function. With any job, there's going to be a certain level of stress. But a lot of the things you're experiencing while playing the game over the course of 20 to 30 hours is stuff that we worked on over the course of 2 to 3 years. So a lot of those discussions and moments, we have some buffer time in between when we discuss the moments and when they're actually implemented. So it's not like we're making those decisions back to back over the course of 20 hours. So it's not we're not always approaching it with the exact same level of intensity that a player will, because they are experiencing it very close to each other. And that's one of the things that, as we're developing the game and we're doing play tests, we're looking at hey, we made these choices 2 years apart. How do they actually feel as a player when you're experiencing them back to back? That kind of thing.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned you've been working on this for 3 years, because I had assumed You mentioned that the success of things like Pillars of Eternity had contributed to the publisher's willingness to work with you on this, and I thought
Yes.
that meant when the game launched, but you mean when it crowdfunded, like back in
Crowdfunded,
2012,
yes.
2013, yeah.
Yeah, basically when Pillars was like completely like overshot all of our projections for how well it would do on crowdfunding, and we basically within like slightly more than a day we met our initial target and then went on to almost 4 times what our initial goal was for the game. Like that level of success was really what was able to say, hey, there's more options here than just Pillars. We can look at use that as a way to talk to other publishers about how successful this type of game can be, and making more games like it is actually a viable option.
Right. I actually want to rewind a bit and talk about choice design. It's one of the evergreen topics here on the. It's just so interesting, the different approaches, and I like what you said, how you said there are different degrees of consequences. Like you're trying to make the best decision you can with incomplete and imperfect information. Can you talk about the guidelines when deciding or when designing a game for interesting choices and consequences?
So I think it's there's always a balancing act, because you want to give players enough information that they feel like that they understand the choice they're going to make and it fits within the context of the story they're experiencing at this point. But you also want to leave room for surprise, because if every choice the player made played out exactly the way they expected it to based on the information they had, the story would be boring. They're no longer going to be challenged. They're no longer going to be surprised. There was a writing course I took many years ago where the guy who was giving the speech had this thing like, if you ever write a scene where a character walks up to a door, knocks on it, and then is immediately let in, you just wasted your and the audience's time for however long that scene took to play out. There has to be some conflict, some pushback on the characters and the viewers' expectations in order for there to be interesting drama. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with a lot of our choices, is create situations where there's some amount of players expecting that things are playing out the way they would want them to, but also having reactions that are true to the characters they're interacting with, but will still be some level of surprise for the player. So when we're looking at like a decision, one of the things we're doing in Tyranny is obviously we're not trying to make the good versus evil distinction. Like a lot of RPGs, you'll have the 5 different varieties of being a good guy, and then maybe there's the evil choice, which is just attacking and killing people. And for us, that wasn't the type of character we're trying to allow the player to play here. We want the different choices to be different ways to react and manipulate and work with the factions that you are experiencing, the different characters. So different ways to modify and build reputations, different ways to play out an evil power fantasy by certain choices you have different ways to decide, oh, this character is going to die. How are they going to die? I can now choose to be slightly more merciful in how they die, maybe giving them a swift execution or sending them to be tortured and killed over long periods of time. Like, giving the players those different choices, it's a different style of power fantasy for the player, but it does build on like that classic idea of like giving the player choices and seeing how those choices react and build the world are really like some of the very common in this type of RPG.
Yeah. The dialogue systems. Sorry, Alex. I can't see your mouth start to move the camera, so like we'll talk over people on accident. So the dialogue system is really interesting because it seems like this has quite a lot of effect. The dialogue system has a lot of effect on other systems.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you talk about how that works and how you designed that?
So one of the main things we did is like reputation in Tyranny has just like one of the core systems. Like for all Obsidian titles, our faction and reputation systems are one of the main things we try to develop. Two of the things we try to do very differently in Tyranny. The first is that our factions are about whether people like you or dislike you based on their own views of the world, not whether you're being good or evil, whether you're doing the good or the bad choice. So in a lot of cases, because you are in an evil empire and working with armies that are also part of that evil empire, ways to get them to like you means doing some very terrible things, from things that they approve of because it advances their objective. But objectively, looking at it from like a detached, like moral perspective, you're doing some really awful things to people in this world in order to win their approval. So if you want to be like getting all of the factions to like you means being a truly awful person in this world. And even if you try to rebel against the Overlord and work with the Oathbreakers, the rebels of this world, you still have to deal with the fact that they're not like White Knight paladins. They have their own agendas, their own beliefs and prejudices and things you have to try and deal with. So making choices that make them happy are also going to have some, like, a lot of moral gray areas to them. So like the dialogue serves to try and drive forward a lot of your reputations with various factions and companions, and then the reputation system itself rewards those choices by unlocking different abilities for your character. So you gain new combat actions and abilities based on whether you make a faction love you or hate you. And so making allies with one faction will give you an ability, but on a different playthrough, if you make that faction your enemy, you get a very different ability unlocked. So you have very different options that how your character will grow and change in the game based on how your companions and the various factions you deal with feel about you.
Yeah, it's a very tangible way of communicating the significance of the choices that you make when you're treating other people in the game. I like that.
Yeah.
So we wanted to. So part of the idea in this world is that how people feel about you matters. It actually influences like some of the larger power progression of the player over the course of the game. That it's more than just about you being special because you're the player character. It's part of your specialness comes from how you have made people in the world think and feel about you. So we wanted to give that a tangible gameplay effect as well.
Real quick,
Yeah.
While I'm reloading because I got my butt handed to me.
Nope.
Gemstrike in the chat would like to ask a question. They want to ask about the pre-production, if any, that was done for the level design of this game, which I'll build on that question and say level design for these games is interesting because I've been conscious of it as we play. And there's very often it's so kind of on the surface. Like there was one zone I walked into where I saw where I needed to go, but I could tell I couldn't get there just by walking right there, so I had to walk around. And so that it felt obvious to me, but I'm also early in the game, so maybe that part was meant to be more obvious to teach players about navigating these spaces.
Yeah, definitely. One of the challenges of these types of game is with the fixed isometric perspective of the camera. There has to be a lot of we have to be very careful with layout to make sure that players understand the relationship of things to each other, both with vertical space and how things are laid out horizontally. Now, obviously, having a lot of people at the company worked on games from Baldur's Gate to Icewind Dale to Pillars of Eternity, there's a lot of experience in how to lay out these levels, so that obviously helped in solving a lot of these challenges. But definitely when we're looking at trying to convey the sense of like structures like castle walls and things like that, we have to be careful to make sure that different layouts work well. And a lot of our levels, we started out with just a very quick block out phase, like very, very rough, untextured geometry that we just render out, get into the game as quickly as possible so that we can start running around it and seeing how the space feels and whether the different relationship of the different spaces works in our environment. And in a lot of cases, we'll do a quick block out and run around and go like, oh, this feels awful. This makes no sense whatsoever. And have to do some iterations and adjustments to get that to feel good. And then once we've got it like decent at the block out stage, then the artists come in and actually like add things like texturing and lighting and proper propping to help really sell the space and the environment we're seeing. So I'm not sure if there's like more other things you were wondering about the pre-production for level design beyond that, but that's like kind of the high level, like 50-foot view of pre-production for levels.
Not a problem, boss.
Can we just talk for a minute about how cool the hyperlink text is in the text? Like, it's hard for me. I'm sure you have a word for this internally. Like, what is it what is the deal with the text where you can like mouse over and then it reveals more like for lore, for lack of a better word? Like, tell me more about that, because that is such a small but significant change to the way this game is designed that I think makes it much better.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that we added. It's one of the benefits of being the game the second game that came out using this engine after Pillars of Eternity. As we were playing it as a team, because as Pillars was getting closer to release, we organized like a couple of company-wide play days of the game where people could play through the game. And actually, the Tyranny team was great. Owners allowed us to spend a week playing Pillars of Eternity, where we just stopped working on Tyranny and just played Pillars for a week, so everyone on the team got a sense of how Pillars had shaped up in the months since we last played it, and as it was getting closer to release, how the game overall was shaping up. And like one of the things that we were like really noticed was just Pillars obviously is a brand new IP. There's a lot of lore that's being like thrown at players very early on, and it can be very daunting, especially if you're not used to this type of game, to really understand all of the different concepts for a game. And one of the things that we had been finding in our own playthroughs is that, especially early on in the game in Act 1, like with the Disfavored, the Scarlet Chorus, and the various groups we were talking about, there was a lot of information that we were giving people right up front, and it was hard, even though that we all knew it, we've been living with it for years developing the game, understanding and remembering the different factions could be challenging for a lot of people. So we were looking at ways to make it easier for people to remember who these different groups were. And we had the like our encyclopedia glossary system that we were using to have a lot of the lore available in game for people. And Pillars had actually had very much the same system of what we call the glossary text. They mainly used it for tooltips for stats and weapons in like item and ability tooltips, so that you could get more information on different stats. We took that and extended it to our conversations as well, and then added glossary entries for a lot of our factions that would display there. And that was kind of the first step we took to say, hey, if we have a link for this, like whenever you see Scarlet Chorus, we have that as a link that you can mouse over to see who these guys are. How much does that help? And we saw from various playtests that it added a ton for people understanding who the different factions were. Like when we would mention Grave and Ash, people could mouse over and say, oh, that's the general who's in charge of this favored. Okay, now I remember who he is and why this character cares about him. So that was kind of like step one. And then we were looking at, hey, we've got this hyperlink system. There's like one of the problems we were trying to solve is the whole your character exists in this world and should know things about it, but you, the player, don't. And we can have like dialogue options where there's like, as you know, Bob, electricity works this way. But really, everyone should know what that is if they've been more than a day old in the world. So we're trying to figure how do we solve that without having really awkward dialogue conversations that are just lore dumps. So we decided, okay.
Did you say lore dumps?
Sorry?
That's good. I like that term. I'm just interjecting here. Lore dumps. That's a good
yeah,
regular lore dumps.
Yeah. We don't like lore dumps either. Yeah.
Like large conversations that just kind of exist to express background, we call lore dumps because we want to make sure that we're aware of them and we understand they're not great, so we try to avoid them as much as possible. So we looked at, okay, we have this hyperlink system. Can we use that in more ways? And like if you play through the conversations, you see there's like two different colors of link text. There's like the gold text, which are our glossary entries that are procedurally generated, and then we have like these green hyperlink text as well. And those are things that only appear if you meet the requirements for them. So if you made the right choice earlier in the game or during character creation, you have the right skills, you will see this hyperlink bit of text that if you mouse over, gives you even more information about the world. And the thing we really love about it is it allows us to get away from the so tell me about electricity types of conversations and just include that information in like the single word electricity that you can mouse over. So it's entirely opt-in. People who don't care about it don't have to worry about it. But the way we structure the data allows us to change what text you see based on your skills or the choice you made, so it's contextual to the choices you made. And we actually found that we use that a lot when you encounter an NPC who hates you because you killed their brother 2 hours earlier. we can have like their initial angry reaction to you linked with this text to say, oh, this is Bob's sister, and Bob was this guy you killed earlier in the game. You had a choice to let him go or let him surrender, but you chose to kill him anyway, which is why she's really pissed at you. And
Yeah.
it helps the player understand the context.
Yeah, and I think more than that, what I want to highlight is that like that whole system opens up an intriguing avenue of game design where we've all played different amounts. Like I've played maybe 8 or so hours this game, and there is a character who speaks directly to the player through that some of those green text bubbles.
Yes.
And like that's a very small, subtle but effective way of like of using a tool that like sounds like it was originally designed to like help space out the lore dumps to directly communicate with the player and sort of like add realism and like sort of flesh out the world. It reminds me of like what we see in like Twine game design and those kind of things, but you rarely see it in sort of like bigger budget productions. And it makes me think like I wonder what these games would have looked like if there hadn't been like if a shift in the industry hadn't moved us away from isometric RPGs in the 90s and 2000s, and it's like engines like had continued to develop and people had continued to experiment. Like it's very fascinating to see like what can be done within this rule set, within this UI, within this paradigm of game design.
Absolutely, I think that example you mentioned, that's something our narrative lead discovered. Like he was working on writing that character, the voices of Narat, and was trying to find ways like how do I make this guy feel creepy in the dialogue. And at that point, we didn't have any voiceover forms, we didn't have any acting to help lend more personality to the conversation. So he was looking like this is a lot of what designers do. We look at the tools that we have that are available to us from programming or whatever. It's like, how can I break this? How can I use it in a very different way that will horrify the programmers when they find out how we're using it, and just go for something that can be very different in game. And he came up with this like that very ingenious way of using the lore links to help convey the personality of that character and help make him feel creepier and more powerful than he otherwise would be.
Do you think that's a... Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask internally at Obsidian, how do you handle lore management? You have a lore management system.
The lore manager.
The LMS.
It is. I mean, obviously, it's a challenge. It's one of the things that, like within a single game, typically you have the people who are the lore keepers, people who know a lot about the lore. Like for Tyranny, it was obviously myself, our narrative lead, Matt McLean, our lead level designer, Constant. We were like the main people who like understood the lore of the game and what the different ideas of this IP were. So other people on the team like would know their own areas or the characters they were working on, and when they needed a broader perspective, could come to one of the three of us to talk about what the actual like the overall game lore was. And then we have our we use Confluence for documentation for a lot of our projects now. So there's a lot of like just lore information that's contained on those wiki pages. That's here's all the information about the Disfavored and the Scarlet Course and the various characters for people to read up on and understand more about the game. The thing that's going to be interesting, like with these IPs as we're able to develop them further, is like creating like the basically a world Bible that keeps all the information in one place for people to understand what went on in various different games. Like several years ago, when I was working at EA, I worked on a project that didn't ship. It was called Ultima X Odyssey. It was going to be that game. It was going to be the next version of Ultima Online. Only it was like trying to continue the story of the Ultima games. And the thing that was interesting there is that when we were working on the game, there was no like information about this is what Ultima was and here's what happened in all the various Ultima games. Like in order to find that out, you had to go back and replay all of the Ultima games from start to finish to understand like here's what happened in this game versus what happened in the next game. There was no real like Bible of the series to go through and read to find out like, okay, what was said about the virtues in 4 versus 5? Like that didn't really exist. So
but you could go back. But you could go back and play it on your own.
Yes.
And, figure that out.
Exactly.
So but Tyranny is a new universe, so you didn't have to dig
Yeah,
too
basically
hard.
everything was like, this is all brand new IP, new world. So right now, all of our Confluence documentation is like, that's what the world is. And then so far the game's doing really well. If it continues to do well in sales, hopefully we'll be able to do sequels and develop more in this world moving forward. And then just keep developing that Bible so we have all that information available for future iterations of the game.
You got it.
Can you talk about like the themes that you stick to? I know that
Chris, I apologize for jumping. I just wanted to grab a question from the chat because because we went on a great string of our questions.
Yeah, sure.
Infinitron chimed in the chat and they're asking about what the future of the game is, and this is a good jumping off point because you just talked about if the game does well, you can expect to make some kind, more stuff around this world. I think kind of to make it a developer-focused question, I'm curious about how you personally feel about prioritizing what you want to work on as you make a kind of a live RPG, even though it's a single-player RPG. Like, it's still sort of a live game that you're supporting.
Yeah, definitely. So because this is a project, that we work with Paradox as a publisher on, some of that is stuff like I can't really necessarily talk about at the moment because we're still in discussion with Paradox about what that's going to be.
Right. That's why I was thinking about even if you can't talk specifically, like what do you prioritize as a developer, kind of deal.
So obviously we wanted, anything that we encounter from the community as like bugs that are affecting progression or the overall experience of the game, we want to try and address as soon as possible and get out in patches. Obviously, since it's a live game, the challenge becomes that every change we make, can't just test for that change itself. We have to look at how does this affect existing save games? How does this affect existing playthroughs? Like, for example, there was a bug that was reported by the community a few weeks ago that normally, if we'd found it before the game shipped, it would have been a 5 or 10 minute fix. But because we had to find a way to not just fix the bug, but also fix all the existing save games for people who had encountered that bug, it ended up being a 2 days of work on the designer side to not just come up with a way to fix it, but in a way to also retroactively fix people who had that issue in their save games. So certain things become much more challenging once the game is live and you're supporting an audience of players who may have encountered this issue going forward. So luckily there have been a small number of those types of issues we've been able to address a lot more. Like, we just released a patch earlier this week that fixed several hundred bugs that we had found before launch but couldn't address before the game launched, and also some major issues found by the community. And as those things are discovered, we're going to keep trying to address them moving forward with various patches, both smaller patches like targeting micro fixes that are really important, and also larger patches that fix larger batches of bugs moving forward. The big question that we still have to solve with Paradox is whether there's going to be DLC for the game, and how much, how often, and because that will determine like how big the team size can be supporting Tyranny, that will also influence like how many bugs we can address and how we can move forward with that.
All right.
After you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alex. So I was wondering, a lot of game developers, they have some kind of pillars or guidelines that they make explicit when, like at the very beginning, almost of development. And I was wondering if there are a few that you really tried to hammer home with your team to make sure to stick to throughout the development of Tyranny.
So I think, obviously the biggest one is Tyranny is a game where you are playing on the side of evil. And that was both in some ways easy, because again, I mentioned a lot of us worked on South Park, we didn't have a lot of filters to try and worry about, but it was also had to be something we had to keep reinforcing, especially early on, because most people, when they come to work on an RPG, a game of this type, there's like this instinctive push towards having like the heroic paladin option for gameplay, and that was something we had to just like keep reinforcing. Like, this is not a game about redeeming the world. The world has been conquered by evil. This is a game about living within the new reality of evil having won, and how you choose to survive and prosper in that world. So as we like play through like quests and talking about like, what the choices players would have over the course of the quest, it was like, especially when people would first join the team, like having to reinforce it. It's not about having the 5 good options and the 1 attack everyone evil option. It's about having options that play upon the factional relationships and the morally gray area, and giving players a lot of just ways to be, like I'd say, delightfully evil. That you can make choices that you're like, oh, the game's letting me do that, and you see a reaction that really like builds on and reinforces that choice you're making to try and play evil, and seeing you can actually do that very well and actually have that play out in a way that feels satisfying to the player. So that was like one of the main things we had to keep reinforcing, especially early on in the project, that it was okay for designers to be bad. We weren't going to be angry at them for making a quest where they focused on the evil options. That was actually what we wanted. And I think once we'd done that enough, then it just people moved forward and really embraced that idea. I think the other big pillar we had to reinforce throughout the game is that we're making a game that's about replayability rather than initial playthrough length. That this is something that when we first started talking with Paradox was like one of their pillars of games they make is they want games that are highly replayable. And typically with most RPGs, it's a game that has like 40, 50, 60 hours of gameplay that you can replay and get a different like class experience, but a lot of the story is like fairly close to what you experienced before. And based on our like what Paradox wanted out of an RPG and how we wanted to make Tyranny stand out and work with like all the constraints of budget and staffing, all those other things we were looking at, we were going to make a game that was about 20 to 30 hours of gameplay, but that would be wildly different as we were playing through. So we had to work with people to understand that when they're designing an area, they weren't designing just one experience within a given scene. They're just designing 3 or 4 different experiences within that scene, and how those different things could work together within a single Unity scene file and not be incredibly bloated and problematic. So that was something that we had to work with our teams on, understanding how we would actually like implement that in a way that was sane and could actually be done in the time frame we had. So I think those were kind of like the 2 major things that we worked on reinforcing in development.
Yeah. Regarding the first point about letting people be okay with being bad, I'm just imagining like a new Full Sail graduate coming into the studio and you turn them into a complete bastard by the time the game's done. But I'm sure that's not the case, though. We do have another question from Gemstrike here in chat. Engine question. They say, I know the game uses Unity under the hood, which we chatted about in the pre-show before we went live, but they asked, did you modify the source? Side question to that, have you ever considered generating additional revenue by selling assets? Interesting.
So the last part I'll answer first. Since this game is published by Paradox, they own all of the assets and IP, so if Obsidian were to try and sell it, we would probably get sued. That would not be a good thing for us.
So that'd be no.
Yeah, we're not going to be trying to sell any of the assets for Tyranny. As far as the engine itself, we use Unity as our game engine and rendering. We do have our own pipeline for generating the assets. If any of you guys followed any of the original like Pillars of Eternity Kickstarter, there's this great backer update video that Josh Sawyer did where he showed how our scenes actually get constructed, where essentially our artists build out the scene as a 3D environment in Maya, and then we render the scene out to actually 2D textures. So, like looking at the scene that we're playing in right now, you see all like the tables and chairs and all these elements that look 3D. Those are actually 2D flat textures that are just baked out with shadow maps and occlusion maps, so that if you move characters around behind them, the actual 3D characters will be occluded by those objects as though they were 3D, but they're actually just 2D flat textures. And the part of the video that Josh did that I'm referring to, he showed a scene that looked like it is now, and then this was loaded in Unity, so he rotated it, and you could see that it was just a completely flat plane with 3D characters walking around on top of it. But given the way our rendering tech works and the camera, it's all done entirely like it all still looks like it's actually a fully 3D environment. And the main reason we did it that way, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, by having the flat backgrounds, we can actually have our characters have a lot more detail and animation detail on them because we're not competing for 3D rendering with the background. We just have the 2D plane is rendered with all its detail in Maya, and can be as incredibly detailed as we want. And since it's just a texture that's being rendered out, we don't have to worry about trying to render all of that at runtime in 3D. And then we can actually, that means we can have more characters on screen with within the memory constraints we have. So kind of plus, because it is 2D textures, our artists can then go in and modify those individual texture tiles in Photoshop, so we can do paint overs in order to really enhance certain areas of the scene, or add more mood and lighting and detail that maybe would take far too long to model in Maya. They can go into Photoshop afterwards and add some more hand painted or adjusted details to the scenes.
It sounds like a similar technique to like what they would do a lot on PlayStation games, like PlayStation 1 games, like first couple Resident Evils, and because of course, you know, with that kind of hardware you couldn't render tons of polygons.
Yeah, exactly. And we were trying to even though obviously it's now several years beyond when the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale games were made. We wanted people with as low end of machines as possible to be able to play this type of game, so that all of the fans that we had that were backers of the original Pillars and fans of this type of game could still play these types of games on their machines.
Yeah. Kind of. Go ahead, Alex.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like, so I kind of want to get into some questions that are a little less game design focused, but we don't have much time left. One thing that's been bothering me that I really want to ask you, and anyone who worked on this game, is like, what do you learn about the nature of evil by exploring its nooks and crannies for 3 years? Like, what have you learned about your own values and like how humans react to like not having an obvious heroic journey to go on in working on this game?
Well, I think it's one of the things we were looking at when we were looking at how to create evil situations, and right now we're seeing one of my favorite moments in the game, which is the end, like toward the end of Act 1.
Yeah.
Anyway, we looked at a lot of just real-world examples when we were looking at like things that have happened over the course of the past century, from how various dictators rose to power, or various complete shifts in societies as various political ideologies came or left from power. Like, that's the kind of how we draw a lot of our inspiration from. That it's not, we tried not to do cartoonish evil, even though we're making a game, and because it is a game in a fantasy setting, there's obviously a distance players have between the things we're talking about and their own experience. A lot of the ways that we try to convey what evil was in this world was just looking at what humanity does. I mean, that's I think one of the reasons why I think Tyranny has been very successful in its story about what being evil in an evil world is, that we tried to keep things fairly relatable and grounded in things that actually could happen.
Yeah, very, very timely. A little too real for my. Yeah.
Yeah, the release date was not anticipated. That it was
brilliant release timing.
Yeah, I think there was the Kotaku article that came out the day after the election, and we're like, I really wish this wasn't a reason to vote to buy the game, but I can't stop people from making the connection.
I wanted to briefly, I was sort of keeping an eye on this game over the last couple weeks because my girlfriend was reviewing it for Polygon, and her review actually touched on a lot of things you said today about even she was, interestingly, because she didn't play a lot of these games before, she was struggling to learn a CRPG and also grapple with what the themes were in the wake of what was going on. Mm-hmm. But I think it stood out. I think the way you've thought about having players interact with evil, even if it's not a clearly good sensation that they have, there's something about this navigation of stuff and negotiating and just trying to sort of live another day. I think it comes through.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
it definitely is one of the things that especially on the narrative team, the writers were they had the struggle of how far to go and how and where to pull back. And I think it's one of the things that, as we watch people like stream the game and read reviews, people playing the game, it's been very interesting, like the dichotomy of reactions we've gotten from people. Because there'll be certain people who will talk about a scene and say, "Oh, this was really disturbing. I can't believe that I made this choice that led to this thing happening to a character," and they felt very morally conflicted with it. And then at the same time, we'll see other reviews like that were very gleeful about like, "Oh my God, I tried to do this and the game let me. This is awesome." So it has been very interesting watching like the various reactions to different choices in the game and how people feel about the choices they made and how some internalize those decisions and what it means about their own personalities as a game player. So that's actually been like fascinating from a developer's point of view to watch the different reactions to the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, but I'm going to do right by the audience and repeat this question from chat, which is, what's next for you after Tyranny? Are you going to join a different team at Obsidian, or?
That's kind of tied up with the questions I mentioned before about our discussion with Paradox about what is next for the game. So I don't really have an answer at the moment. It's something that's still being discussed, but yeah, I don't know yet. We will find out hopefully in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
Right on.
You're gonna get over being sick. That's what your first step is.
Absolutely, yeah. That is my my goal, is to not be sick for the rest of the year,
Yeah.
which means January 1st I will come down with the flu.
So we do have about 5 minutes left, and I do want to touch on something that we talked about pre-show a little bit. But you mentioned, like, we haven't really talked about combat design in this game, and I've been watching Bryant with a T play it. And you had mentioned 6-second action rounds.
Oh yeah, so I think it was related to, we were talking about some like the original design ideas behind like the Infinity Engine games, whether it's Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale, where they were
Classic
a lot of the
D&D.
designs for the game were based on pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons gameplay and trying to recreate that experience in a computer format. And like one of the ideas with with D&D is that each character round was effectively 6 seconds of time, and a lot of like the design decisions was trying to like replicate that idea as far as like this thing can take place within 6 seconds. And even though Pillars of Eternity and Tyranny, we're no longer using D&D as the foundation of our rule set. Like we have very different rule sets for the game. People who played the Infinity Engine games still have certain expectations based on that, so they end up informing a lot of how like the design for these games progresses. So I think one of the things that happens in combat is that each character has like a recovery time before they take actions, and part of that is based around like the overall like pacing of combat with a party-based game, trying to make it something that you can actually understand and follow as the game plays out, and also just based on standards that were set by those original games when they were trying to replicate the D&D tabletop experience.
So your Twitter bio describes you as a gigantic nerd.
This is true, yes.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about more about the D&D influence, and it's quite pervasive amongst obviously RPG video game designers.
I think it's one of those things that I actually played less D&D growing up as other tabletop role-playing games. My friends, when I first got into my first tabletop experience, was actually using a system called Riffs, which was my first experience with party balance. Because I had scoured through books, and the character I was creating was what I would call a techno mage or techno wizard, which was my level 1 character had a basic attack was a 1d4 magic bullet pistol type thing. And then the DM who was running the campaign, it was his first time as a DM, so he didn't really think about excluding certain classes as party. So I created my techno wizard, and my friend created what was called, I think, a glitter boy, which was giant mechanical power armor with a Gatling gun cannon So like our very first combat encounter, I roll my 1d4 and get like 3 points of damage off. He then proceeds to roll every d6 known to man for his single attack and obliterates the entire enemy party and their entire family as well for 5 generations. So
with Glitter Boy.
with Glitter Boy, yes.
It
It was a
dynamic duo.
Yes, exactly.
I just want to point out that's one of the nerdiest things I have ever heard. To the point that, as a nerd myself, as a giant geek, I am strangely now feeling like an '80s high school thing, and that we are all about like some jock is about to jump out and throw us all in a locker just for saying all the words that were just said.
That's every day at Obsidian.
Nice. Yeah. Well, cool. I think we're wrapping up here. Like, we only got a couple minutes left.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what you've been doing here, Brian?
Yeah, I think that was actually a great mission to stream, because that was just a really cool, like, summing up of all the things. That mission was really cool for me, because it was summing up all the things we've done, and I've done up to this point in this opening act of the game. Like, I was able to get a soldier who I spared earlier to turn on her allies at the cost of her own life. I recruited this new mage character here because I was pretty kind to her earlier, and she was like, okay, yeah, I'll tag along with you. You seem like a good way to not die. And I was able to get through a pretty intense boss fight that I actually watched Carly. I had to help Carly through it when she was playing it, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to have so much trouble with this. And I did, but I was lucky that because I helped her out with it earlier, I was able to figure out some stuff about it. And I also discovered the talent system, which I hadn't known about before because nothing had pointed me to it. So that's basically been the last couple minutes. I think that was a really awesome start to this, where this game's going to go.
Yeah. So Brian, well, we might have another question here.
Oh yeah,
we
let's
can
get this
maybe
question
just
before we
wrap
finish it up.
Yeah. So Infinitron asks, did you have to wrestle with memory limitations with regard to the maximum number of characters on screen in Tyranny?
Yeah, there were definitely some issues we had to deal with as far as animation footprint and how data gets saved out into save games. There's actually in our patch that we just released this week, we had a fix for an issue we encountered where the way the engine was saving out animation data, a lot of the data was getting duplicated for every character. So, like, whenever you would save in a scene and then reload, the information, like a single animation controller would get duplicated 5 or 6 times and really bloat a lot of the animation information that was getting loaded into the game, which I think we've saved over 100 megabytes of memory in just fixing that one problem with this most recent patch. So, and there are other memory issues we're trying to track down and solve over the course of the game, and hopefully we'll be able to fix them for future patches. So, it's definitely been things we've had to try and deal with and wrestle with the engine, and even though a lot of problems were solved by Pillars of Eternity team and how they handled things, we were able to grab a lot of that code and fix a lot of those issues. There are still, it's like the story of game development. Whenever you fix one bug, 10 more crop up as a result of that fix. So
right.
Obviously we're trying to still keep on top of those and get out more patches to help address issues the community is seeing.
Yeah, very cool. So I think we're officially out of time, but really appreciate you coming on, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, the game is Tyranny from Obsidian and Paradox. I am the voice of the ghost of Chris Graft, editor-in-chief of Gamasutra.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. And there's also Bryant and Alex. You could say goodbye.
Yeah, Alex, I was going to say, you should say goodbye first. Alex?
I think he's gone.
Oh no! Well, we were joined by news editor Alex Waro, or his ghost,
That was
I should
me.
say.
Hi, I hit the mic button by accident. Sorry. Thanks everybody. Brian, you've been
Thanks,
great.
everyone. Bye. Don't forget to subscribe. You can watch,
please.
you can watch an archive of this as well.
Yeah, we'll have the VOD up shortly. Please subscribe for more developer interviews and gameplay commentary. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.